This is a Shane Plays podcast extra. Content that was not recorded as part of the live Shane Plays radio show. Enjoy.
Shall we play a game?
Why, yes. I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Hey everybody, welcome to the special podcast edition of Shane Plays Radio, a journey into the things we love. I'm joined again by Dr. Randy Duncan, who is basically the superhero doctor, and I'll explain that a little bit more here in a second. If you'll remember, Randy joined us several weeks back on the actual live show, and there was so much more cool stuff that we could have talked about, but we ran out of time that he very nicely offered to get with me to record a special podcast. So, which I do on occasion when there's more stuff I want to get to that we couldn't do in the show. So thanks so much for listening. Randy is Dr. Duncan, if you will. He is a professor at Henderson State University in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, which is just shy of my neck of the woods. I'm out of Little Rock. And then in addition to being a professor, he is basically a subject matter expert on comic books in various aspects of comic books and the medium and the different genres and what they can be. He's got 4 books to his credit. One is Creating Comics, his journalism, memoir, and nonfiction. He's got The Power of Comics, which we talked a little bit about on the live radio show. He's got Critical Approaches to Comics, Approaches and Methods. And then, did I say that right, Randy?
Theories and Methods.
Critical Theories and Methods. Okay, yeah. Critical Approaches to Comics, Theories and Methods. And then Icons of the American Comic Book. And many comic book characters are, of course, iconic in the true sense of the word. So when you see that visual, it represents something, immediately makes you think of something. So, well, welcome back. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me back.
Yeah, man, I'm really tickled. What we're going to be talking about today is 2 things. We had just kind of touched on when you came on the show what makes comics such a unique and uniquely engaging medium, because it engages people like no other medium out there. And I had mentioned that I was sort of a subscriber to the theory that Scott McCloud has in his book Understanding Comics, which I think anybody who's into comic books on any level, of course, should read. And he had mentioned the concept of closure, which we'll get into later as being one of the things that made it so unique and uniquely engaging. And you said, yeah, there's something to that, but I think there's even more stuff going on. And I was like, well, that'd be a cool conversation to have. And then also what we're wanting to talk about today is it is Will Eisner week. So you had mentioned, hey, as long as we're going to be talking and it just so happens to be Will Eisner week, I want to talk about Will Eisner, and I'm totally with that because, he's a major name and a pioneer in the Western comics art form, and his impact on what we know as comics today is tremendous. So anyway, welcome back. Feel free to throw anything else in there about yourself that you want, and let's just go ahead and jump into mention anything you want about your books, your teaching, whatever, and then after that, let's just jump into the Will Eisner week stuff.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I think we talked about this last time, that we now have a comic studies minor here at Henderson State. So pretty much every semester I'm going to teach a comics class, which is pretty cool.
That is cool.
We're doing a nonfiction comics class this semester, team taught with myself, an art professor, and a journalism professor. And students are starting to do their first work in there, and some of it is really pretty good. So that's always nice to see.
Very cool. All right, very cool. So how long have you been teaching comics? Not just teaching in general, but teaching comics as a thing?
Since the early 90s.
Okay. Oh, wow, that long. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm one of the founders and organizers of the Comics Arts Conference, and we began that in 1992. So I think I'd been probably teaching a couple of years before that. So actually, probably 1990.
Nice.
within my first comics class.
So you were ahead of the curve as far as, wanting, because I think a lot of people, especially in mainstream society, are just now seeing comic books as an actual, medium and to be to be reckoned with, I guess, if you will, not just, as much as fun as the Batman TV show was from the '60s, the Biff Bang Pow got so much into our culture,
Right.
right, that it's taken a long time for people to shake that as what comic books are. So wow, so you've been doing this for almost 25 years,
Oh
or
yeah,
no,
no
over
use saying how
25
long.
years.
Let's say.
Yeah, 90. Yeah, so wow, good for
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
All right. Okay, so I know that you know a lot more than I do about Will Eisner, but assume that I and the people listening have no idea who Will Eisner is and what Will Eisner Week is all about. So do you want to
Okay.
go ahead and, all
Okay.
right. Yep.
Uh, well, late 1930s, still in the Depression. A kid in his late teens needs to make money for the family because his dad doesn't work full time. So he's determined he can use his art talent to make a living. Um, he gets turned down a lot at first, ends up um, forming a studio, though, with a fellow who had edited a magazine that he did a couple of pieces for, and that magazine went out of business. So they formed the Eisner Eiger Studio with just a few dollars in their pocket. And they happened to do that at the time that the comic book industry started to explode because Superman had appeared in Action Comics #1. And suddenly lots of other people thought they wanted to get into the business of making comics, including the accountant who worked for National Periodical Publications and saw the returns on Action #1 and left that company and wanted to start his own company.
Said, hey, there's some money to be made here.
Yeah, yeah. So he
Yeah.
asked the Eisner and Eiger studio to create a Superman ripoff, essentially, Wonder Man, um, and promptly got sued out
Oh,
of
did he?
publication. Yeah,
Okay.
but but Eisner and Eiger continued to do other more legitimate work. Some of it less derivative and more original. Um, and
So
it was
I mean,
mostly
I
Will
hate just to
Eisner.
back it up. Was Wonder Man that close to Superman? Because
No, not
almost
really.
every
But
comic book character can be traced back to another comic book character
right,
in some
right.
way. Yeah.
But I think they realized at that point that they wanted to try to defend that turf. But then the tidal wave came, and there were so many imitators,
Right.
they could no longer do it. But they sued Fawcett Comics with Captain Marvel because he was throwing a car on the first
Right.
cover of his comic, and Superman was lifting one. And that took
Right.
a number of years for that to get settled. But
How did that settle, if you don't mind me asking?
well, DC Comics, which was National Periodical Publications, it now owns
Captain Marvel.
Captain Marvel. So,
Okay. Well, I guess that
so
tells us how
yeah.
that settled. So okay.
It's more complicated than that along the way. But anyway, Eisner was doing okay at that, but he got an opportunity to do something that was very different than what was happening in the rest of the comics industry. He was asked to put together a comic book that would be a supplement for a newspaper, kind of like the TV Guide. Comes along with a newspaper as a supplement.
Right.
Um, so, most people who were working in comic books really wanted to work in comic strips because it was more money, it was more prestigious, and so he wasn't doing a comic strip, but he was in the newspaper in this unusual way as a comic book supplement. And 3 stories in the supplement, and the first one was The Spirit, which was his creation, and that's kind of what he became best known for. And he did that for about a decade, for most of the '40s, except that for the time he was in the military.
So the Spirit was being delivered via newspapers, not an actual comic book.
Right. Well,
I
it
never,
was a comic book, but within
but within a
newspapers.
news. But I mean, it wasn't on the news. Like it wasn't on the. And I
On
don't
the
know if they
newsstand.
had them back then, but they wasn't on
Yeah.
the spinner rack, if you will. It was
Right.
just okay. I did not know
Yeah.
that. All
Yeah.
right.
And it didn't have an actual cover. Um, just the first page served as the cover. So that's one reason he did those creative splash pages, because that.
Right.
But it was the first page of the story. And so, he was still a young man. He was, in his 20s during most of that time, and really creative and ambitious, and experimented a lot with comics form. It was a new art form, and even then, if you read the interviews he did, he was like, this is my art form. I want to, perfect this. I want to make my living doing this. Whereas most people thought of it as, I'm doing this for now till I get something better.
Right, but he
Uh,
saw it as this was my art form. This is where I want to develop my craft.
right.
Like he didn't. He's not like I'm. He didn't think he was slumming.
No, no.
Okay.
Um, and because of that, he became the textbook. His Spirit Stories did. It became essentially the textbook that the following generation of comics artists studied for how to use the comics form, how to compose a page, how to use angles, for pacing, all those sorts of things. So he was hugely influential in that way.
So if
Now,
you
in the early
took, oh, go
50s,
ahead.
he got kind of tired of doing the Spirit section, it was called, the book with the 3 stories in it. And he started a company that was essentially doing comics for the corporate world. Sometimes they were like little brochures in factories telling you how not to get your fingers caught in the machine. Some of them were PR things, like for the Baltimore Colts. And then he got a contract doing a comics magazine, mostly comics, for the Army on how to maintain equipment. Now, when he was in the Army, that's what he had done. He stayed stateside and made informational comics telling people how to do maintenance on their Jeep.
Okay.
So then, years later when he was out of the Army, he thought, that's I didn't get paid except just the
Right. The
a
the
corporal
army.
salary for
Yeah.
doing it.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
but now I can charge him more for that. Um, so for about 20 years, he essentially disappeared from comics. It seemed like, and he was making tons of money
That's
from
interesting.
government and from corporations.
That's interesting. So he's still like the medium, but I guess he got tired of doing because the Spirit was basically a Pulp Fiction character, right? I mean,
It was. It was. He did it very tongue in cheek, though. He had fun with it, and he didn't want to do a superhero, but that's what they wanted because they said, "Well, that's what's popular." So
right.
he put a domino mask on him, but
Right.
otherwise he wore a suit,
Yeah, a suit and a
you know,
fedora,
and
and
some gloves. Yeah,
yeah, that's the iconic. Speaking of iconic, when you see the guy with the suit and the domino mask, and the tie always seems to be flipping or something.
yeah,
Yeah. So there's just so so Spirit. So about the only other character that is kind of like the Spirit is in my mind is the Question, running around in that
right.
suit, even though I know that, stylistically they're very different characters.
They had one that was a kind of a direct copy called Midnight, um, and then what was the Alan Moore one from
Well,
his
that was
America's Best
Rorschach.
Comics? Hmm?
Oh, not Rorschach.
No,
Blue shirt,
um,
gray shirt, something like
Gray
that.
Shirt. That was it.
Yeah,
Yeah, Gray
yeah,
Shirt. Yeah,
yeah.
it was a homage to the Spirit.
I did not
Yeah.
know that. Okay. Yeah.
Um, but anyway, then in the early 70s, Will Eisner sort of reappeared to comics fans
Just kind of came
because he
back
was
out of
this
nowhere.
legendary person who had done this
Right.
great thing in the 40s and then disappeared essentially. So by the time there were real comics fans in the 60s and a fandom movement and conventions, that helped make him kind of mythic almost.
Right.
What
Right.
about that great guy? Whatever happened to him?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, but someone invited him to a convention, which he went, a what?
Yeah. Who? Yeah.
Because he's a businessman at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Uh, but he went and he saw Underground Comics, and that just blew him away because he said, "Well, these people were just doing whatever they want to do. They're doing very personal things." He kept up enough. He knew there had been the comics code and all of that, and so that got him excited about I could do comics again that weren't just corporate comics or government
Right.
comics if I could tell the stories I wanted to tell. Um, so it was a combination of excitement and tragedy because his daughter passed away from leukemia. I think she was 15,
Mm.
and so in 1978, his first kind of major work after reemerging was A Contract with God.
Right, which I have read. Um,
The
that's
first story
actually
is
one of
about
his.
the
Yeah,
man who adopts a girl and then she dies, and
right.
yeah, and so I talked to his widow some when I was doing some research on him, and she said that for Will, work was therapeutic, and she said for one thing, it's all he knew. He had just always worked hard all his life, and and he had his own studio, who were producing these educational comics and things, and they said, well, Will, after his daughter passed, why, take some time off, but she said time off he'd have just gone crazy with time off. Um, and so I think that project was a very therapeutic thing for him. That first story, the Contract with God story. And then there's a couple of other stories that are based on his experiences growing up and just things he had seen in his.
Right, like tenement stories, and that was it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, because he'd grown up in the Jewish ghetto in New York,
right.
um, and so, but he was about 60 years old. Don't make me do math on the fly. But when that book came out, um, and it was kind of the beginning of a new career for him because he did 20 more graphic novels after that one.
Wow. Yeah. See, I haven't read all of his stuff. I've read some of the Spirit. I've read a Contract with God and other tenement stories. And then I know he did the book Comics and Sequential Art.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
which is essentially the first theory of comics. It was before Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics.
right.
Um, so yeah, he went from being this mythic, this legendary figure to coming back and being a living legend.
Right. Without even
uh,
realizing, he's like, "What? What is all this? Yeah,
yeah,
let me
and
step back into here."
he
Yeah.
he was still going strong when he passed away at 86, I think. And yeah, they'd suggested he have heart surgery, and so he did it, and then there were complications. I think fluid on the lungs or something, and
Mm,
that often happens in hospitals with older people. But he, after the surgery, he was in his room. I talked to Dennis Kitchen, who was down there with him, and he said, "No, Will's doing great. He just can't he can't wait to get back to the drawing board," which he would have done as soon as they would have let him out there,
mm,
of that hospital if things had gone better.
gone better.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It says here he died January 3rd, 2005. He was actually aged 87, so you were darn
Oh, okay.
close. Yeah, darn close. So, um, yeah, and of course he was born in Brooklyn, in New York City, and if you read what you have, I know I'm just saying in general, if you read like A Contract with God and under other tenement stories and like Dropsy Avenue and some of the other stuff he's
Right.
done, I mean it's basically this steeped in what it was like to grow up like in this incredible, deeply Jewish neighborhood
Hmm.
in New York City. In the sense of community and the crazy things that would happen. Um, and a lot of it, I don't know if some of the stuff is directly autobiographical, excuse me, but it's, I mean, he's definitely drawing on stuff he grew up with in a
Right,
lot of these
right. Yeah, most
stories.
of
Yeah,
it's not direct. I mean,
yeah,
that final story in A Contract with God about how young Willie loses his virginity, I think is pretty much autobiographical.
that
Uh,
one. Yeah, I wonder why Willie. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
There's some pretty strong storytelling in there on some pretty what some people might raise their eyebrows at the stuff he's going into. But he's like, this is how it was. This was the
yeah,
life I
yeah,
grew up
yeah.
in.
The
Yeah,
building superintendent that you think probably molests children, but then the sociopathic little girl that that kind of takes advantage of that situation.
yeah. There's
Won't give
definitely
away too much in case people want to read that
and read
story.
it. Yeah, it's good stuff, and a lot of I think a lot of, especially maybe because there's always new generations of readers coming into comic books. A lot of what we know as the Western, especially superhero comic book genre, came from either Jewish immigrants or people who grew up in these
Right.
intensely Jewish neighborhoods.
Hmm.
So, I mean, Superman was created by, I think, two Jewish people. In
Right. So
fact,
you don't see.
they drew on the Moses, story being put in a basket and sent down the river, and or at least that's
Captain
what people.
America was created by two Jewish creators.
There you go. Well, you got, I mean, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby
Yeah,
were,
yeah.
and so it's interesting that it all came out of that ethnic slice of life, if you will, of New York City. I wonder if there's something unique about what they were going through that led to creating these superheroes. I don't know. I mean, I'm just completely thinking
There's
off the top of my
actually,
head.
well, there were three books that came out about that pretty close together. Uh, One by Danny Fingeroth, had been the Spider-Man group editor at Marvel. Um, the oh, what is his called? Um,
I can look it up
it's
real
just from,
quick.
huh?
I said I can look it up while we're,
Oh,
yeah, Danny
I think the
Fingeroth.
subtitle is "How the Jews Created Comics."
Uh,
Oh, disguised as Clark Kent is the main
okay.
title. Just yeah. And
Yeah.
then there's one from Krakow to Krypton, or it might work the other way around. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so so yeah, some mostly by Jewish writers who were comics fans or involved in the comics industry who kind of wrote about that aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, when you really, I mean, there has to be some psychological, cultural, psychology going into all
Right,
that.
right.
It's like just a perfect storm of things going on. So,
And
um,
I think when we kind of brought up this topic last time, I might have asked if you'd read The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay.
no, but I added it to my Amazon wish list.
Okay, so
So,
now the professor is checking up on you. Like, have you done
yeah,
your reading
if you
assignment?
don't, and that's where it's sort of a fictionalized account of. Uh, was it a fictionalized account of Simon and Schuster? Is that what
Well,
that is?
there's a little bit of Will Eisner in there. There's a little bit of Stan Lee. So his two, and a little bit of Jack Kirby. So his two main characters are an amalgam of the early creators. But it's a story about the early days of the comics industry. But it's also about the Jewishness
Right.
of the mythology that
Right.
was put in there. So and it won a Pulitzer Prize for literature. And so it's just a darn good read.
Well, I mean, imagine it, and I want to go where I want to, keep talking about Will Eisner, but I guess this leads into it because this is where was what he came out of. This was his
Right.
upbringing. But imagine how good that would feel as a Jewish person to publish a comic book with Captain America punching Hitler in the jaw.
Right.
You know what I mean? I mean, the catharsis or whatever that I mean,
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
it would have had to have feel amazing to do that. But anyway, so this being Will Eisner Week, and I've seen it mentioned several places. It's got its own website. I see places that there are events across the country, basically
Yeah. Across the globe.
across the globe,
Yeah.
honoring
Yeah.
Will Eisner, remembering his work. He's obviously had a massive impact on comics. Uh, and then I know that there's the Eisner Awards, right?
Right.
That they give
Yep.
those out to
The
comics,
major awards of the
right?
industry.
It's like the Oscars of comic books,
Right.
basically. Um, what are some of the, I guess, the technical innovations that he did, right? As far as I know, you mentioned angles, like perspective angles, and what are some of the technical aspects that he brought to the medium as far as in advancing the art of comics that other
Okay.
people have imitated?
Well, and you'll really see this if you read his theory books, graphic storytelling and comics and sequential art. That, and he doesn't make any bones about it. That he's kind of telling you how to control the reader, not just influence the reader, but control the reader. Because as a creator, he's thinking, well, this is the experience I want people to have.
Right. This is where I want your eye to go, and this is what I
Yes.
want you to
So
think.
so
Right.
yeah, he wants to control the reading progression across the page. He wants to control the reading pace. He wants to have control over the emotional reaction um, thing. So um, putting it in that context, he was doing more to kind of experiment with those aspects, particularly timing in comics and the pace of something, um, but also how he used color when things were in color, or how he just used the blacks in a panel to create the mood. The spirit was very film noir in some of the
Right.
stories.
Right.
And you know, he said that he watched Citizen Kane repeatedly to try to learn those film techniques, and
Huh.
he also said that since his dad was involved sometimes in painting scenery for theater, he went to the theater a lot and he looked at stage lighting and thought about how to use light sources, but not even try to have realistic light sources in panels, but just how to be dramatic with the light.
Right. To use it dramatic.
Um,
Right. Right.
yeah. Um, so he was always thinking in those terms of I want to control the reading path, I want to control the reading pace, I want to control the emotional response, um, and so all sorts of things he was doing to try to get people to experience the story the way he wanted them to.
So, did he do anything like, a lot of comic book creators, artists, they will kind of pioneer how they're using panels on the page to lead the eye, or to actually kind of break out of the panel for dramatic effect. Did he do anything on along those lines?
He
Or,
did. He did. He would have long, narrow panels. He would have little, small, staccato panels sometimes. And so, again, that sense of how to vary panel size in order to vary the rhythm of it. Now, he would admit that he wasn't making this stuff up whole cloth, that he was very influenced by film, but he was also very influenced by Milton Caniff, who did the Terry and the Pirates comic strip.
okay.
Um, it's just that Caniff was constrained by that comic strip format. You know, uh, but Eisner was learning a lot of things about composition and about use of light um, from him. Uh, but he had a comics page to work with, and that gave a lot more flexibility.
Okay. So I know that Jack Kirby really established a lot of standards for, especially in superhero comics, about how to tell a story
Hmm.
and how to tell action, how to draw figures, how to represent, you know, dynamic power and all that. Would at this, and I know that a lot of artists have, basically, um, have been super influenced by Jack Kirby. Well, would you say that Will Eisner or that Jack Kirby has had more impact in how comic artists compose a page?
Well, I think if you look at mainstream comics, mostly the superhero comics, probably Jack Kirby has had more influence. If you look at alternative comics, um, and you look at graphic novels, then perhaps Will Eisner has had more influence.
Interesting. Okay.
Um, I think there's definitely some crossover there, because most of the people who are doing, um, very idiosyncratic graphic novels, um, and who seem disdainful of superhero comics grew up reading Jack Kirby and
Right.
superhero comics,
Yeah.
before they kind of got into what they were doing. And even though it's not as noticeable, they will admit that some of that is still influencing them.
Right. Well, I love superhero comics. There's just no, I can't get away from it. But I do appreciate, comics as a medium in and of themselves. Like, it doesn't have to be superhero to engage me. And there's a lot of people, as we even talked about when you're on the show, that are using superhero comics to tell other stories just because superhero comics is what they can get work in, but they're telling mystery stories, or they're telling, this or that. And you know, but I am glad to see that, especially, like, I look at even like Image Comics. Image Comics is putting a lot of stuff out that is not superhero genre,
Right, right.
and they're getting it on the same stands. Image is doing all that. I IDW, and I know there's a lot of smaller publishers out there, uh, but I'm talking about the main, like when you walk into a comic book shop, the publishers you're most likely to see on the shelves. You know, uh, Image is putting out a lot of stuff that's not superhero. They're giving a lot of people a chance to, kind of stretch their wings, if you will,
Hmm.
and use the comic books as a medium. Um, and then IDW continues to impress me with these weird comic books that they're putting out that are kind of superhero, but they're kind of not. I mean, they just did a 5-issue Godzilla in Hell, which was did you see this
No, I didn't.
Godzilla? It was, they told the story, and it's, basically, it was 5 issues, and they were kind of connected and they were kind of not, and they basically took a different creator each issue and said, Godzilla's in hell, tell the story. And so you got all these different interpretations of, so I guess the point I'm saying is there's a lot of cool stuff out on the book, on the racks right now.
Oh yeah, there's never been more good
right.
stuff. I mean,
Yeah,
I said that a few years ago, but like each year there becomes more good stuff. It seems
gets
like
more and more. And then of course you've had people like, Alan Moore, who have, I think we also mentioned this before, Promethea was basically a primer on magic,
right.
and the Kabbalah, so you've got some crazy stuff out there. If people want to get back into reading comic books but are tired of superheroes, and I can see why they would be, because the longer I read comic books, the more I see, man, they're repeating the same story over and over, or they've reinvented this character so many times, it no longer has resonance with me, right? Like,
Yeah.
like how many times can you blow up the universe and start over until that doesn't do anything for me anymore, right?
According to
It's like,
DC, every 5 years. But
yeah, exactly. And I mean, I love the stories, but I used to be a continuity freak. I used to like, don't mess with my continuity or you're going to make, but now I understand why continuity is a constraint. It's like, how do you tell a
yeah,
story with a character 30 years later
yeah,
and
you
keep to
exhaust the
this? Yeah,
possibilities.
exactly. So anyway, all right, well, we've spent quite a bit of time on Will Eisner, which I don't mind a bit, because, he's such a powerful figure in comic books. Is there anything you wanted to add, before we move on, about Will Eisner?
Just that I hope that more people will try to have Will Eisner week events next year.
Okay.
We're when you look at that list of places around the world, Arkansas is always on there, but that's usually Arkadelphia, Arkansas. So
Right.
I'd like to see some other Arkansas locations on there, and it's a flexible sort of thing. My Will Eisner week event is actually on March 17th.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Yeah. So,
Because we're like, yeah, it's like horseshoes. You get close to the
yeah, you
weekend.
get close. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, that's funny. So, and what can people expect at the Arkadelphia Will Eisner Week event?
Well, I'm giving a talk at the Arkadelphia Arts Center about graphic novels for adults. So it's kind of an educational sort of thing to say, you may not think you want to read graphic novels, but I'm going to tell you about the ones that you would love if you just gave them a try. Um,
Okay. There you
and
go.
I'm going to cover some graphic novels for younger people too that they might want to buy as presents for kids or nieces or nephews or something. But yeah, it's just kind of an overall introduction to. There's a lot of really interesting stuff out there that you don't know about.
Okay. So, what would you recommend if somebody's listening to this, uh, and they're like, you know what, I want to read one of these non-superhero comic books. I want to read a non-superhero graphic novel and see what the potential of the medium is. What would you? Is there a go-to that you recommend?
Well, I mean, there's the big four that are taught in English classes in college
Let me see if
nowadays.
I can. Let me see if I can guess at
Okay, you
least
can
one.
probably guess what they.
Is at
It's
least
the big three, but I think it's going to be four soon. So
is
that's
at
why.
least one of them Mouse?
Yeah, that's the one at the top of the list.
Okay, I would. Yes, Art Spiegelman. Is it Spiegelman?
You're right. Uh-huh.
Art Spiegelman's Mouse. Um, I would recommend Understanding Comics as an
Yes. Uh-huh.
example of,
Yeah.
because even though it's a textbook on comics, it uses comics as a medium to demonstrate the potential. So those are the two I would. Now I'm talking about non-superhero, because I
Right.
would recommend people read, Watchmen. I would recommend people read, um, Dark Knight Returns, and even Frank Miller's Daredevil, some of Alan
Yeah.
Moore's
Yeah.
work, but
Maybe Superman for all seasons.
Superman for all seasons.
I think Superman for all seasons and Superman Red Sun work well together
Yeah,
because one is a very Norman Rockwell version of Superman as all American from the heartland,
right.
and the other is but what if he had landed
Yeah,
in the
what if he had
USSR?
landed in Soviet Russia?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So, what are the other two? What are the big four then?
Okay, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel.
I haven't read that. I'm naughty. I need to read that.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
it has become a Broadway play, and I think won a Tony Award. Um, and Persepolis
Yeah,
by R. James Chichak.
I have heard that. I've heard about that. I've seen it at the library. I need to grab that and read it.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
and there's
yeah.
you should read the graphic novel rather than just watch the
Yeah,
film. But there's
that's
an
what I would have
animated
did.
film that is one of the best adaptations of a graphic novel I've ever seen. I mean, it can't cover everything the graphic novel does, but she was very involved, in the making of it, and it's very good. Um, and I think the one that will be the fourth one is March. Congressman John Lewis's memoir about the civil rights movement that
Oh, okay.
he co-wrote with his congressional aide, Andrew Iden, and it is illustrated by Nate Powell, a North Little Rock native.
I didn't know that. So good for Nate.
Yeah,
Way
yeah,
to
yeah,
represent Dogtown, Nate. So,
yeah,
all right.
yeah. I'm doing a
So,
little thing on Nate right now, and so I'm learning more about Nate than I ever knew before.
then
And he won the Eisner Award in 2008, I think, for "Swallow Me Whole."
I need to
Was
reach out to him. I'd like to have him on the show. I wasn't even
Yeah,
aware of
yeah. Well,
that.
he doesn't live
Yeah.
there now. He's in
Yeah.
Bloomington, Indiana.
Well,
But
there you go.
for what you're doing here, distance is no object.
Yeah, the
Uh,
Bloomin' guy moved on me. Darn it. But anyway, so there was a couple of non superhero books that I've either read or perused lately that struck me. One was I can't remember the name of it, but it was about the dog that the Soviets launched
oh,
into
Leica.
space. Yeah, the great, fantastic. Just there was stuff. It was just killing me to read that. It was emotionally wrenching to
Yeah,
read some of
yeah.
that. Um, and there was another one. It had like an ironic title. It was about like hobos. This young kid traveling with an
Oh,
older hobo.
Kings in
Yeah,
Disguise.
yes, to say it had kind of an ironic
Yeah,
title.
yeah,
I almost said like We Three Kings, but and
yeah,
those two were very. I would recommend people maybe check
yeah,
those
yeah.
out as well.
Those are good. I think one of the most underrated graphic novels is Vietnam America,
I'm not
and
familiar.
it is it's another memoir about a young man who's Vietnamese heritage, but he was born in South Carolina, I think. Grew up in the U.S. and just typical American kid. And his parents finally convince him to take a trip with them to. I think his grandmother's passed away, and he goes to South Vietnam. And so it's partly him discovering his culture, and it's partly him discovering his family history, which he had had no interest in before.
Hmm.
Uh, and yeah, his parents went through some pretty horrific things, and
Mm,
and they got out on that last day. That
right.
vision we have of people clinging to and falling off of helicopters, and
Yeah,
uh,
they were pushing stuff off of aircraft carriers to make room
yeah,
for people. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that
and
was crazy.
and so he's just like he didn't know that about
Yeah.
um, and so some of the things that have made it difficult to get along with his parents, he learns more about why they are the way they are, and so it's just really interesting, and he makes wonderful use of the comics form, and so
Vietnam America.
Vietnam America by
Okay.
G.B. Tran.
Okay. Yeah, we'll check that out.
Yeah,
I was not familiar with that. So there's so much out there. It's both a blessing and a curse because it's
it
like I'll
is. It
never get to
is.
everything, but wow, there's so much good stuff to get to. So
Yeah, and I shouldn't be saying this out loud on the air, uh, but Scott McCloud, has a graphic novel, The Sculptor,
uh-huh.
that came out last year,
Uh-huh.
and I have a signed copy, and I'm going to read it, but things
Yeah.
just keep coming up.
Yeah. So Scott, you didn't hear that.
Yeah, I know. So ignore that.
No, yeah, no, he understands.
Because my
So
excuse was, oh, I'm waiting to get
yeah,
a copy signed by you, Scott.
yeah.
But then I
Before I
did
read
that,
it.
and now I still haven't read it, so I'm ashamed.